Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Deck Tech for the Classic League Season 4, run by MOG, run out of the Classic Quarter forums. And so I chose to play an LED Bob Tendrils deck because I thought that with the format veering towards efficient disruptive creatures and away from lockdown workshop prison decks, that Storm would be a pretty good metagame choice. Basically, Storm's really mortal enemies are Dredge, which can be faster, and Workshop, which can be completely disruptive. I mean, one single sphere against this deck is incredibly difficult to overcome. Two spheres is impossible, and so basically, any decks that are playing sphere effects are the Achilles heel for this deck, and I thought that the metagame was getting away from anything of that nature, so it was certainly. I thought it would be a good time to bring out this deck. Now, I haven't written a full deck tech about Storm decks. That's something I will get to in the future, but in the interim, here's the deck I'm playing. I have one caveat. For some reason, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure how this happened, but I built this deck without one of the more important lands that kind of gets abused more in this deck than others. Is Tolarian Academy. I'm not exactly sure how I missed it, but another thing that I did fail to take into account was for the fact was I was supposed to have two islands instead of two swamps, two basic islands, and that was because of one card, Mind's Desire. To be able to hardcast a Mind's Desire, you basically need two islands, and that's what this deck should have. So other than that, this deck is fine. I think it was a rush on my end to get the deck list in after kind of debating which deck it was that I wanted to play and deciding that I did want to go with a Storm deck, throwing this together to try and tweak for the metagame a little bit and trying to make it a little bit more explosive than what some Bob lists have shown over the last few months. But nonetheless, those are a couple of nitpicks aside with the mana base. But for the most part, the spells in this deck I think are pretty much card for card what I would choose again going forward. That being said, let me walk you through the deck as it is and how it works, and look at some of the strengths that the deck has. So you look at the mana base here. It appears light on lands. It's only 15 lands, so I mean you are subject to draws where you get 1 or 0 lands. In fact, I mean 0 lands is probably the one thing that's most problematic. You can get by with this deck with only 1 land. You obviously can't get anywhere without any lands, and so for this deck, it is prone to getting draws where you draw 7 spells and no lands, which is unfortunate. But sometimes that's the risk that you have to take with a deck like this. But in terms of the choices, like I said before, I would switch one of the swamps for a basic island, and probably either a fetch land or an underground sea for a Tolarian Academy. But the mana base is pretty strong. It's a straightforward blue-black deck, so there's no need for different types of fetch lands to splash different colors. So you've got a full package, 4 underground seas, and 3 basic lands with 8 fetch lands. Now the fetch lands are nice because what they do is they allow you to both work in conjunction with Brainstorm, but also to protect against wastelands. And in this deck, you really, really want to be using the first fetch land that you crack to fetch a basic land, because you want to be able to have something on the board that can help you go off in later turns if you're just trying to simply cast a duress or cast a brainstorm to get you get the game moving. So it's highly advisable to grab a basic land with your first cracked fetch land. But the fetch lands are great. They will provide a built-in sort of protection against wastelands. Now, strip mine is a completely different matter. Stripper mine is problematic, but thankfully it is restricted. So the mana base, 15 lands. It's aggressive, but it's appropriate for this deck. But going along with those 15 lands, there are 12 other mana source engines, if you will, in this deck, not including the de facto Black Lotus, but I'll get to that later. So you got your standard Mana Vault, Sol Ring, and Mana Crypt, mana producing artifacts, as well as a playset of Lotus Petals. And I included one Chrome Mox as sort of an additional accelerant that this deck could use, again, because you're playing with 15 lands. Chrome Mox helps turn, maybe a draw where you have, say, 2 Dark Confidants in your hand, or maybe you draw into a Tendrils of Agony or something, and you want to accelerate the game a little bit. Maybe even play the Chrome Mox with the ability of casting Duress without having to crack a fetch land. Those are some of the things that I've tried to capitalize on having this singleton. Now, I mean, obviously it does not come up very often, and sometimes it's a completely dead draw later in the game. But luckily, this deck doesn't necessarily have that type of a problem with dead draws. I mean, everything is pretty much live in this deck, and in reality, Chrome Mox is also just an additional storm count. If nothing else, you don't have anything else in your hand, and you're kind of late game. Maybe you're attacking with Dark Confidant. You've got your opponent down to maybe say 10 points. You can cast the Tendrils, hard cast the Tendrils for 5 in this deck fairly easily, to knock them down, or even just Tendrilsing for value. For if they're down to 10 and you got a couple of Dark Confidants out, Tendrils them for 4 or 6 damage, and sometimes that life swing can be enough to turn the tide of the game. So that's kind of the reason why I chose Chrome Mox. It's not a very typical choice for people to make, and of course, the staple of this deck, Dark Ritual. This is one of the two engines that makes this deck work. Is the Dark Rituals. It gives you access to be able to cast some of the spells in this deck, and fuels your storm count. So the real engine of this deck, and one of the unique things to Classic as opposed to say Vintage, is the interaction between Lion's Eye Diamond and Infernal Tutor. For those of you that may be watching and are not familiar with how the interaction works, what you do is you pay and cast Infernal Tutor while holding down the control button as you click it after you tap your mana. What that does is it allows you to retain priority, at which point Infernal Tutor goes on the stack, and while it is on the stack, you can sacrifice Lion's Eye Diamond, which makes you discard your hand to give you 3 mana of any color. It's going to usually be black. Sometimes it will be blue if your goal is to play a Mind's Desire, but it'll most likely provide black mana. And what it'll do is it will strip your hand to turn Infernal Tutor into a de facto demonic tutor, where you can pick any card from your library, which makes Infernal Tutor with a Lion's Eye Diamond basically using the unrestricted Demonic Tutor. Most Bob Tendrils decks with LED play 4 Infernal Tutors. I find that sometimes that's a little too much. Maybe it's just the way I've been playing lately, that I've been drawing it more often than I really feel comfortable with. So basically what I did was I just replaced one of the Infernal Tutors with the Chrome Mox. Now, maybe that's wrong, but it's worked in the few games that I've played. I think 4 de facto Demonic Tutors is enough. Other people play with 5, like I said, 1 Demonic and 4 Infernal Tutors, but I found that 3 is enough to get by, especially when you're playing with Dark Confidant and you're drawing upwards of 2 cards a turn. It seems to come up a little bit more often for me. But that's basically the how the deck really functions. And what you use when you cast Demonic Tutor or Infernal Tutor is you snag Yawgmoth's Will, and hopefully at that point you have at least 1 Lion's Eye Diamond, maybe a Lotus Petal, a Dark Ritual, or 2 in your graveyard, at which point you do the whole routine over again. You cast a Dark Ritual out of your graveyard, maybe a Lotus Petal or something else that may have come out of your graveyard to fuel additional mana. Then you rinse and repeat. You cast your Infernal Tutor and Demonic Tutor again after you've played a few more spells and built up your storm count, and then presumably you have enough mana to go and fetch your Tendrils of Agony and storm them out. And that's basically how the deck works. That's the primary function of the end game of this deck. And there are a couple other win conditions that are built into this deck, but that's basically the plan A, if you will. So other ways to help move along the game plan, pretty much a standard Imperial Sealed Vampiric Tutor to help put missing pieces into your hand. These top deck tutors are obviously not nearly as powerful in this deck as Demonic and Infernal Tutors, but they are critical to potentially getting the one card or 2 cards that you might need to basically set the game up in your favor. So maybe you're playing against another control deck and you are looking for a Duress or a Thoughtseize to be able to see if they have a counterspell in hand, so that you can just figure out whether or not it's okay to go off, or just to simply take a look at their hand and grab the counterspell that you need to get things going. So that's basically what those are doing. I mean, there's other times where you might want to top deck maybe Tinker, so that you can Blightsteel maybe a missing piece of your Time Vault key, or simply just a Dark Confidant on turn 1 if you've got a hand that's not necessarily powerful. You can top deck for a Dark Confidant, so you can hopefully start gaining some cards. The cards have their use, which is why they're included in this deck. Additional card advantage routes you've got. This is a blue deck. Although most of the spells are black, it is technically a blue deck. In instance, so you've got your standard playset of Brainstorms. They are the best draw spell available, and with the fetch lands, are pretty much as close as you're going to get to a Ancestral Recall in this format. As I mentioned several times before, you've got Dark Confidant, who plays a really brilliant role in this deck in giving you more fuel. Hopefully you draw into additional Dark Rituals and whatnot, and also provides a somewhat of efficient clock at 2 mana on maybe turn 1 or turn 2 to start getting your opponent down, and even chump blocking, if you will, because this deck uses its life total as a resource. and sometimes, including Dark Confidant himself, sometimes this deck quickly can get raced to single digits, at which point Dark Confidant is a pretty efficient blocker against Tarmogoyf and many of the other creatures in this format that could be strictly problematic. So, Bob plays quite a few different roles in this deck. And Singleton Necropotence here. This is quite possibly the only deck in the format, only deck in existence for that matter, really, that could profitably play with Necropotence. One of the interesting things, as you'll see in one of the matches I played, I discounted the every time you discard a card exiled ability. So when I cracked my Lion's Eye Diamond and discarded my hand with a couple of spells that I wanted to eventually recast, especially I think it was Tendrils of Agony, they went into my exile pile, and I was not able to win the game because of it. But aside from that, Necropotence is, the single greatest card advantage engine that is available in Classic. Really, it fills your hand up, and at the cost of 1 life and 1 card, there isn't a better bargain out there. It can be cast on turn 1 behind a land and a Dark Ritual, and at that point, you're pretty much, the way you use it basically is to, at the end of your, during your main phase, you activate it to give yourself +1 or +2 cards, depending on how many lands you might have in your hand. And what you do is you draw draw to 8 or 9 in your end step, so that you discard 2 cards to get down to your necessary 7, and hopefully they're 2 lands and not important spells. So you are consistently giving yourself the 7 best cards that are off the top of your library. So that's the reason why Necropotence is so great. It's an old card of a era gone by, but it is certainly as powerful as you can imagine it being in this deck. And this deck has a very light disruption package. It's got a Singleton Hurkyl's Recall in the main deck, and that is mostly as a nod to Affinity and Workshop decks. Those decks will completely render this deck impotent, and it's entirely necessary to be able to go off on the turn that you want to by playing a Hurkyl's Recall. Hopefully you haven't been locked out to the point where they've got two or three lock pieces on the board, spheres, because sometimes getting to 4 mana in this deck without using a ritual, which will end up costing you an additional mana, is difficult. But this is necessary, so I have a Singleton in the main deck, which can be fetched up by top deck tutors or whatnot. I have a split here between Duress and Thoughtseize. Obviously the Duress Thoughtseize split, I put a little thought into it. Because this deck uses life as a resource, I didn't want to overload on Thoughtseize, even though this is a creature heavy metagame right now. So sometimes in these creature decks that are running counter spells, they're running Snapcaster Mage. So it's it's essentially, even if you Duress a mental misstep out of their hand, they could very well cast a Snapcaster Mage and get that card anyway. So Thoughtseize has a little bit of an additional protection. It can also get rid of an early Tarmogoyf or whatnot. But I didn't want to go with more than 2 because, again, this deck does use life as a resource. Mana Crypt, Vampiric Tutor, Imperial Seal, Necropotence, Dark Confidant, they all use your life as a resource. You're constantly spending life in this deck, so you don't want to overload too much on Thoughtseize when you're really trying to protect yourself from counter spells, which is why Duress is functionally slightly better. So I went with a 3-2 split. I can see definitely a 4-1 split. obviously in favor of four duress, one Thoughtseize, but I personally thought in this creature-filled metagame, a second Thoughtseize might be a little bit better. And so that rounds up the engines of the deck, and I'll get into the win conditions here right now. So basically, the deck does run a bunch of artifacts. It's blue, so it's a prime Tinker possibility, which is why Tinker is included in this deck, included with a Singleton Blightsteel. Now you're never going to hard cast a Blightsteel. You're just never going to get to that much mana. I suppose it could be possible if you say had Tolarian Academy and two, maybe 4 artifacts with 2 rituals in your hand, 3 lands. Yeah, I don't think so, but nonetheless, basically, you're just trying to knock out a quick win condition that could just be lucked into your hand. Additionally, there's the ubiquitous Time Vault and Voltaic Key combo. Again, that's something that Tinker can also fetch the second piece of it, so as you can also use your tutors to find the missing piece if you draw into one of them. And basically at that point, you're just controlling the game to eventually win. I mean, once you've got them locked up, this game, it's trivial at that point. The only way it becomes a little bit tricky is if you've got either a Mana Crypt and or a Dark Confidant in play. If you've got a Mana Crypt or Dark Confidant, there's a possibility that you could still find your win condition before you might die. If you've got both, I would probably let somebody play that out before just snap conceding, because they think they got a Time Vault Key lock on me. But other than that, aside from those two things, if neither of those are in play, this deck, Time Vault Voltaic Key works great. Finally, Tendrils is the main win condition after you cast Yawgmoth's Will. Basically looking to storm for 8 to, I don't know, maybe 16, 20 spells if you've got a great draw. And what you're basically trying to do is build up a count where you can win it in a single turn. I got 2 copies of Tendrils of Agony for a couple of reasons. One is basically in case somebody for some reason has one of the Jester's Cap or a Sadistic Sacrament in their deck where they have to take 3 of your win conditions. If I only had a singleton of Tendrils, a singleton of Mind's Desire, they could take one of each of them and maybe Tinker, and this deck pretty much doesn't work. But in my instance, if somebody does that and they have to take 3 cards. If they take both of my Tendrils and a Mind's Desire, I have both Tinker and Vault Key to potentially win the game. So it's not out of the reason. I mean, it's difficult, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that that something like that could be relevant. I also think that there's also room in this deck for Tendrilsing for value, if you will, where I mentioned earlier, you're Tendrilsing for storm count of 3, maybe 4, and you're dealing 8 damage and getting 8 life. And if you got a Dark Confidant on the battlefield, and they've got pretty much, not much going on, I mean, you can buy yourself a few turns to potentially cast another Tendrils later on, or might be just simply be enough to bring you over the top. So that's why I include 2. A lot of people include 1. I think it's a little bit too aggressive. Sure, I would love to have one of these Tendrils, another spell, maybe a 4th Duress with 2 Thoughtseize would be great. But I think for my play style, 1 Tendrils is not quite enough. I also have a copy here of Mind's Desire, and Mind's Desire is one of those strange cards. It's restricted in Vintage, but Classic has it as unrestricted. Vintage has a little bit more tools to abuse Mind's Desire, namely namely the Moxen and Black Lotus. But I think Mind's Desire doesn't quite get enough credit in the classic metagame. But one of the unique things that is now relevant about Mind's Desire is that it does get around Grafdigger's Cage. And Grafdigger's Cage is a problem for this deck, as I'll get to when I get to the sideboard. It is a problem. There's no doubt about that this deck does have to respect the fact that there is Grafdigger's Cage in the metagame. But what's amazing about Mind's Desire is that the cards are exiled. They're not put into your graveyard, so you're not flashing them back out of your graveyard. You're casting them from exile, which Grafdigger's Cage does not prevent. So if your opponent gets down to Grafdigger's Cage, and you're kind of stuck in the unenviable position of not being able to replay some of your spells, you can tutor for Mind's Desire and maybe storm for 6 or 7 if you're holding your spells back and not not putting them in the graveyard. You can Mind's Desire for 6 or 7 and hopefully Desire into another Tendrils, or Tinker into Blightsteel Colossus or Voltaic Key or something along those lines. Hopefully you can Mind's Desire into another one of your win conditions. That's basically what you're doing, or just hard casting Blightsteel Colossus. That's basically what Mind's Desire is really doing, and it's a valuable win condition in this deck. I don't know if this deck would really want more than that, because 6 mana is really aggressive, especially 2 blue. But it's a great win condition in this deck, and the ubiquitous Yawgmoth's Will, which makes this deck really crank up the power level. Basically, like I mentioned before, you're first tutoring up for Yawgmoth's Will after you've maybe cast a Dark Ritual or 2 and playing cards back from your graveyard and recycling and rinse and recycling, ultimately ending up into fetching a Tendrils for lethal. So going to the sideboard, this deck has a few particularly important concerns built in. I did mention that Grafdigger's Cage is a card, and as a result, there's a few cards here in the sideboard meant to deal with it. Namely, we have Chain of Vapor, which is just a 1 mana spell that we can use to bounce the Grafdigger's Cage to the opponent's hand on the turn that we want to go off. We also have a Echoing Truth, just in case there's potentially more than one Grafdigger's Cage. It also works for Leyline of the Void, which is also very crippling to this deck. Multiple Leylines of the Void can be knocked out with this one single Echoing Truth. And we also have 2 Hurkyl's Recalls, in addition to helping with the shot matchup, can help with bouncing Grafdigger's Cages back to hand. Also in a pinch, if you want to up your storm count and you're not running up against any potential artifacts, Hurkyl's Recall can bounce all your 0-cost artifacts, and even a Mana Vault and a Sol Ring at 1 mana, they net you positive mana. But you can bounce them back to your hand and play them back out to help up your storm count in a pinch. So that certainly will help in situations like in a Mind's Desire and trying to Tendrils for value or something like that. So those are some of the unique uses for Hurkyl's Recall. Against decks, all the creatures decks in the format with Wastelands, the City of Traders is a great 2 mana producing land that gives you the ability to both add additional mana to the deck in the face of Wastelands. So if I'm running against the Wasteland heavy deck, I might throw in the 3 City of Traders over a Chrome Mox and a couple of the other spells, maybe some Lotus Petals or whatnot, to help protect against getting blown out by a Wasteland. City of Traders also helps against the Workshop matchups, because the land essentially negates one sphere. So each City of Traders that you have negates a sphere. So even if you've got a City of Traders in play and a City of Traders in your hand, you can tap the City of Traders to get the mana, play the second City of Traders to get 2 more mana, and you've essentially negated their spheres for that turn. So that's very important, especially if you're trying to cast a Hurkyl's Recall to get around those spheres or whatnot. Line of the Void is kind of a great catch-all, like everybody else uses it for fighting off Dredge, obviously, and even in the mirror match against other storm decks or other decks that rely on using the graveyard. It's just a pretty nice catch-all. And I also have 2 surgical extractions here, which gives you a little bit of value. It can be cast for just 2 life without using any mana. So there's quite a few uses for that as a graveyard hate card, which is why I like it over, say, a Jailer or Relic with a Relic of Progenitus or Tormod's Crypt or something along those lines. I like being able to use the surgical extraction as kind of I mean, it won't be a surprise in the matches where we know each other's decks, but at least surgical extraction, I can think ahead of time what potential cards I could use it for. So when I do go to sideboard, I could say, all right, yeah, I want to bring in surgical extraction in this matchup because X card I want to try and get rid of it. It's usually it's great for things like if you've got an early duress and you take out a Force of Will, you can follow that up with a surgical extraction and rip all the Force of Wills out of their deck, or any other types of counter spells for that matter, or other problematic cards. Maybe maybe you're on the play and you go turn 1 duress and strip their Grafdigger's Cage, and you can rip the Grafdigger's Cage. I mean, there's many functional uses for surgical extraction, which is why I chose it over some of the other graveyard hate cards. So that is the deck. Pardon my long-winded discussion on it, but I think it certainly it's an underplayed deck in the format, so I don't know how many people really understand how the deck works, and also discussing the rationale that I chose to decide to play with this deck. So thanks for watching and enjoy the matches.